Emergency measures this week as the city of San Diego aims to address the homeless crisis and the deadly outbreak of hepatitis A. The traditional fire season is here, but lots of regional fire personnel are elsewhere battling western fires that have scorched 8 million acres this summer. And what the Catholic Diocese in San Diego is doing to protect kids from potential predators 10 years after a $200 million settlement of sexual abuse lawsuits. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, reporter Lisa Halverstad of Voice of San Diego. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Mark.
Good to see you today. Reporter Susan Murphy of KPBS News. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Mark. Good to be here.
Good to have you here today. Reporter J. Harry Jones of the San Diego Union Tribune. Hi, Jay.
Mark, how are you?
Good to have you today. And reporter Peter O., also of the Union Tribune. Hi, Pete.
Hey, Mark.
Glad you're here with us today. Well, permanent shelters, temporary shelters, outreach teams, creative policing, housing programs, rehab programs, job training, hot meals, medical care, tough love, even jagged rocks. San Diego leaders try all sorts of things to deal with the city's homeless problems. But the situation on the streets has only gotten worse, much worse. Now an outbreak of hepatitis A hitting the homeless especially hard adds new urgency to the problem. And Lisa, start there with us. How bad is this outbreak and what actions are being taken right now?
Well, it is one of the deadliest hepatitis A outbreaks that we've seen in at least 20 years nationally. So this is a very serious issue. At this point, there have been 16 deaths. Almost 300 people have been hospitalized, and there are more than 420 cases that we know of at this point. And it seems that it's just going to be continuing to grow, and the homeless population is really disproportionately hit by this.
Okay, and we'll get to some of those details on what happened, on what they're trying to do, but the county sent a stern directive, more hand washing stations, many more. Did the Mayor Faulkner and city leaders kind of drop the ball on this and drag their feet some?
Well, there's been a lot of finger pointing on this issue. One thing that I would say is that it was clear early on that the urgency that one might expect with an outbreak that has been this deadly was just not there. So early on, the county itself, who is the public health agency responsible for dealing with this, had started with a pilot program to put hand washing stations out. Now, they've really emphasized vaccinations, as we'll talk about, because that is the #1 tool. But for this population in particular, they do not have the same access to sanitation and restrooms that all of us sitting at this table do. So there are some, elements of that that help to really inflame this situation and spread the virus a lot more.
Okay, and Tanya, have you got some numbers on the vaccinations? You were updating those, and how many folks are they getting out and trying to vaccinate?
Yes, so at this point, at least 21,000 people have been vaccinated. And at least 7,000 folks at this point who are considered to be most at risk have been vaccinated. And the county's really emphasized that a lot in its approach to this. One of the challenges, though, especially with the homeless population, is that many of these folks can't just walk into a clinic to get a vaccination. So they have foot teams of nurses and homeless outreach workers going to do the vaccinations. What we've really seen, though, in the past couple weeks is a big increase in attention to the sanitation piece of this. So the city has hired an outside group to do some cleaning, bleaching of streets downtown in different zones. And we've seen now there are 45 hand washing stations that have gone up, which, earlier, as I said, the county had a pilot project just a few weeks ago. There were just 2 of them.
Okay, so that's really increased. Pete?
Yeah, Lisa, I was wondering about that cleaning of the streets. I understand they've got these high-pressure hoses. They're washing the streets, with this chlorine kind of mix. Where does that go? Does that just fall into the street and then wash on out into the ocean?
That's a good question. So there had been a lot of concern, I know, initially on the city's part of how do you deal with the stormwater issue. The emergency declaration kind of helps them get around that regulation-wise, but that's a good question. And I don't think, certainly in the reporting I've seen, I haven't seen a clear answer on that.
Susan, big tents going up again. That's another thing that's happened this week. We weren't going to do the temporary tents, and now we're back doing the temporary tents. Where are they, and how many will they house?
And so it sounds like they're starting out with 3 tents, but it's going to take several months to get those up. 2 of the tents are located where the previous winter shelter tents were placed for decades.
In downtown.
Up until 2 years ago, we had winter tents that were open 5 months of the year. And so these tents, one will be in Barrio Logan, Imperial and 16th Street. The other one near Father Joe's Villages, and I can't remember the location of.
So the other is actually, it's in Midway, and it's where the Veterans Tent used to be.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
So I was down, in the East Village, where we have, I guess, the biggest population of our unsheltered homeless population. I was just asking them what they think of these tents and if they'll willingly go to stay there. And many of them were in big favor of this. They're just exhausted from living on the streets. They're exhausted from living amid squalor. They feel unsafe, especially with the Hepatitis A outbreak. They just want to gain a foothold and get their lives back, to have somebody, helping to take care of them until they can, find healing. And I did talk to, I do have some clips of 3 people. I spoke to Deborah Luzader, Stephen Hillard, and Gay Tharp. And
Good, let's hear that.
let's hear those.
I think it's a good idea because a lot of people don't have tents to sleep in, and they usually sleep on the ground with no blankets.
Yeah, I want to go now. I really do. I hope they put it up.
Well, that can be beautiful. Tent shelter is good. It's community living, and it's good.
Would you go there?
Would I? No, I got other things to do right now. Pressing matters myself.
Quite a difference, because when I was out talking to people about, why don't you go into emergency shelters? People, didn't like the strict rules of an emergency shelter. They couldn't check in until, evening hours. They were kicked out at 5 in the morning. They couldn't bring their stuff. They couldn't bring their pets. They weren't with their friends. And this is a different situation. Bob McElroy, I talked to him. He's going to be running. He ran the winter tents.
Remind
for 2
us who he
decades.
is.
Bob McElroy, sorry. He's with the Alpha Project,
Sure.
so they will be running the
16th
one of the
and
tents, the
Newton.
16th
Yeah.
in Newton, right?
Longtime advocates for the homeless.
Right, and
Yeah.
so and people really trust him, and so he creates an environment of safety and peace and dignity, allowing with lots of different services, allowing people to have these services and meals and showers and all sorts of things.
Now, what are the folks you speak with downtown? What are they saying about the hepatitis situation, that crisis?
They're very worried about it, but it seemed that they didn't really know about it. They've been talking amongst each other, but they don't really pay attention to the signs, because I pointed out, do you read these signs? And oh, there's a sign, I was asking one person that I've known well, who's homeless, on 17th Street, and I said, do you know somebody here who has hepatitis A? He started calling people, and they started coming out of the woodwork, and I was like, whoa,
Yeah.
But he said, all you have to do is look for people whose eyes are yellow, and he was pointing out, like, this woman here, like, look at her eyes.
That jaundice situation.
Right, but the number of people who approached me wanting to share their hepatitis A story was troubling.
Jay?
Either of you know what are the homeless numbers right now, and how do they compare to the past year?
And how reliable are they, really?
Well, what I can tell you that is specifically downtown, which is kind of the area that a lot of us think of when we think about homelessness in San Diego, over the past 2 years, the numbers have more than doubled. So a downtown count, which is different than the point-in-time count that we hear about every January when they go out to do it, had shown that now, as of the end of last month, we're at 1,400 people living on the streets in downtown San Diego. And the big majority of them do live in East Village. But countywide, there's also been a pretty significant increase in street homelessness. And one of the big increases is in people that are in tents, which also makes this more visible than we've seen really, historically in San Diego.
And I'm down there so often,
Susan?
and you see people who are just lying listlessly on the street. There's just so many people, just lying there amid, on these sleeping bags in filth. I tried to talk to this one man slumped over in a wheelchair who just looked really in bad shape, and his voice was so faint that I still talked to him. He was trying to talk to me, and I thought to myself, I wonder if anybody really has ever heard, what this man has to say, or who he is, or what his situation is, and it's just really a crisis.
The politics comes into play here, of course. Ultimately, we're talking about money and public money here for a lot of these services and to deal with these issues here. Has City Hall been dragging their feet? The mayor says we've had this emergency declaration for some time. Councilman David Alvarez says, no, we need a new or double down on emergency, and he has some other ideas. What do you think?
Well, Mayor Kevin Faulconer's office has been involved in emergency declarations in the past 2 years. Now what folks are saying is, well, this situation has gotten even worse. So even though we have this existing state of emergency, the shelter crisis, maybe we should call for something more. So a city council committee actually voted this week to kind of bolster the existing one and send that to the full city council for vote. One thing I would generally say, though, is that Mayor Kevin Faulconer made some significant commitments at the beginning of the year. He said he wanted to add quickly hundreds of shelter beds, and more than 6 months passed. Now we're at 8 months since he made that commitment, and he's now promising, yes, I will open 3. I'm hoping maybe 1 by the end of the year. Early on, he'd been saying he really wanted consensus on this. That's kind of been just a basic tenet of his leadership. He really prefers to have consensus and then to move forward. With this issue, there's not a lot of consensus. And so with the big difference that we saw this week was he came out and he said, I know I'm not going to get consensus. We need to act now. Meanwhile, though, there are a lot of regional discussions that are happening about the best approach to this. And there is some discussion of a regional plan, but there really hasn't been huge backing behind that or public discussion about that. And I do think that what we're seeing right now in the Hep A crisis that we've got here is really pushing that. People want to see a plan. They want to see some kind of strategy. And the issue with shelter is that it's not a final strategy. A shelter cannot be a permanent destination. And so what advocates and others ought to be looking at here is, can we move people through that shelter to a permanent home? And historically, we haven't had a lot of success moving people through shelters in San Diego. This past year, only 25% of people moving through city shelters ended up in permanent housing.
Wow. Well, we've got plenty more to talk about as we move forward and shows in the future, and we'll look for that plan and all. It's terrific reporting this week. We're going to move on. It's been a brutal summer for wildfires in the western United States and Canada. Some 47,000 wildfires have scorched more than 8 million acres across the U.S., much of the destruction in Oregon, Montana, and California. San Diego County, which lost thousands of homes and buildings in 2003 and again in 2007, has been mostly spared this year so far. Jay, what are firefighters saying about conditions? We had a lot of rain last winter, and sometimes you hear both sides of that. Well, it's going to be bad, a lot of growth. It's going to be bad, there's been drought, not a lot of growth.
At the beginning of every season, they say it's going to be bad for one reason or the other. This year there have been hundreds of fires in San Diego County. We just haven't heard about most of them because they're kept very small, and that's the whole idea, is to attack them right away. There's a lot of dry grass out there. There's tons of dead brush that accumulated over the drought, ready to go, but you need a spark for that. And we haven't had the right weather conditions this year so far to have a big firestorm like we talked about last decade.
Right, and those, for people who were here, they were just horrific. I mean, people across the country were shocked at that, as the destruction we've seen from the hurricanes in Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. And it's, it can change in 48 hours. We can get a forecast, those of us who've lived here a long time, and it's terrifying weather. You would think tourists look at it and say, oh, picture postcard weather here, clear and sunny and warm, and it's just deadly when those winds blow. But we have had some hot weather here, but explain briefly, we haven't had that Santa Ana winds, those hot, dry winds from the east that get everything going.
The combination is the high winds, the low humidity, and the heat isn't as important an element. It's the winds that really push everything. And so far, so good. Usually, historically, they come in October, late October, and that's what they're worried about, again, as they always are.
But that puts us right in the middle of the season now, September, October. Although, is the season lengthening? I mean, we had those fires in May a few years ago, 9 fires for 4 or 5 days here, and several homes were
during
lost.
Freak Santa Ana winds in May, which threw everybody for a loop. And is it climate change? What's going on? Something's going on. All across the country, the weather is weird. And fires can start any time. Still, the most worrisome time is coming up now.
It's coming up right now.
Yeah. Isn't October the time where vegetation reaches its very driest point? And
been baking all summer. And
if we haven't had a whole lot of rain, a whole lot of moisture. And
it's really all about the humidity level. If you just get a day or two of really low humidity, everything dries up like a bone. And then if the winds come and it sparks,
conditions are perfect. Now, in your story, you noted that certain areas of the county, certain places are just more vulnerable than others. Explain why that is. What are some of the places that are looking more vulnerable?
Every place can burn, in every little canyon, valley, inland, on the coast, as we saw in 2014. But if a place is burned, an area is burned, and more recently, there's less fuel for it to consume, so it won't burn as fast or as fiercely. Areas that they are especially concerned about are areas that haven't burned 50s, 60s in recorded history in some cases. The back of Palomar Mountain and the Agua Tibia Wilderness area to the northwest of that hasn't burned in almost 80 years, they think. And even though there aren't a lot of people that live up there, the idea is if the winds are blowing, it'll push it and keep it going into the real populated areas. In 1970, there was a fire called the Laguna Fire, which was at the time the biggest, and it took 33 years before there was another one as big. That whole footprint from Mount Laguna all the way into El Cajon in the East County hasn't burned since then. And if that same footprint were happened today, it would be thousands and thousands of homes. Back then, it was a couple hundred homes. And then Pine Valley, both north and south of Interstate 8, in the forest. Again, not a lot of people live there, but it hasn't burned in many, many years. And again, it could burn quickly into populated areas.
All that fuels. And we've noted in 03 and 07 how destructive those fires were. What are some of the changes since then? I mean, we've made some improvements, we've mitigated some things, we're certainly communicating better, the firefighters are, right?
And the county says they've spent $400 million since 2003 on improving firefighting efforts, and all sorts of new technology has come in, which has helped a lot in a lot of things, detecting them. Certainly the alert systems with our apps and everything else is much better now. And SDG&E has done a tremendous amount of work by replacing all the poles out in the backcountry with steel poles, and the wires are further apart so they won't spark as much, and they have ways of turning off the much more efficient, quick ways of turning off the power should the winds reach a certain level. Hasn't happened much since they put that into effect a number of years ago. We all know it's coming. It's just when.
Yeah, and we're all watching the weather like crazy. A couple seconds left on this segment. You also noted in your story that a lot of the firefighters in this region are elsewhere fighting fires, as you noted at the open here. So we spread a little thin if conditions get bad and a fire starts?
That, and they're also out helping hurricane victims. That's not abnormal this time of year. What they worry about is that the fires will, up in the west, in Montana and in Northern California, that the season will continue again because of this changing weather patterns that we seem to be having, and it would keep them up there into our most critical points. We have enough people down here, but should a big fire happen, you want everybody on board.
Okay, well, we'll all keep our fingers crossed till the rains in November come, and it's that time of year. Well, we'll move on. It's been a decade since the Diocese of San Diego gave up its years-long battle and settled with more than 140 victims of sexual abuse by clergy. The Roman Catholic Diocese paid out nearly $200 million and posted voluminous facts about priests and their crimes on a website. And it's undergone a host of changes in dealing with persistent problems related to sexual abuse. Pete, you had a very thought-provoking, thorough story this week on all this and what's happened since. You started with a victim, and her question really was, are they really taking care of the children now? So start there. What changes has the diocese made, and how is it different than it was, say, 15 or 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think you really have to start with the victims here because it was such a terrible betrayal of trust. I mean, priests in the Catholic Church, and probably ministers in any religion, are looked on with a lot of reverence. But in the Catholic Church, I mean, they're almost like, almost deities.
God's representative here.
Right, they're speaking to you in God's voice. So to be sexually assaulted by someone in that position, it's just devastating. So what has happened since then? I guess it depends on who you ask, but the diocese says they put in place a number of programs to kind of eliminate or at least minimize, instances of this. For one thing, everyone who is hired by the diocese, everyone who volunteers for the diocese, has to go through a background check. Even if you're a missionary coming in from the Congo, say, and you're coming to a congregation, you're speaking to them to ask for money for your mission work, even that person has to have a background check before they can.
Who may never deal directly with children while they're here, yeah.
Right, but I think the current bishop says, listen, I mean, in the past they've said, well, we'll put a priest who's under suspicion, into some role where they don't deal with children. He says there is no such role. Every priest, sooner or later, is dealing with families. If you're dealing with families, you're dealing with children. So there are the background checks. There's a new curriculum for Catholic schools, also for the kids who don't attend Catholic schools, who go to the church for, catechism during the week, on how to recognize warning signs of a sexual predator and what to do about it. They're trying to reach out to the parents, talk about that as well.
And you wrote about this panel, too, that looks at
the panel's very interesting.
Specific incidents that come forward.
Right. Now, the panel is made up primarily of lay people. There is one parish priest on the panel, but the rest of them are all lay people. There are lawyers, there's a retired judge, there are marriage and family counselors, and there's also a survivor of sexual abuse. So if there's an allegation, the allegation goes to this panel. The panel hears the testimony. The diocese hires a private investigator to investigate the case. So they gather all that material together. They are the determiners of fact. Then they give a report to the bishop. The bishop has to decide what to do.
Well, you had a very interesting interview with Bishop Robert McElroy here. I should note, he was not here during the sex abuse scandal. Well, and what does he say generally now about how the church deals with this issue as compared with how they did in the past?
Yeah, he says, well, in the past, what he thinks was a real problem was that these became legal issues. So they're being fought out in court. It's an adversarial system. And bishops were told, don't meet with the victims because it's going to look bad, when you're pulled into court. He says, it's essential, really, to meet with the victims. He said the first time he met with a victim, it was devastating, just to hear directly about the pain and the betrayal. But in the past, they did not. In the past, it was very much adversarial sort of situation. And also, I think as you've pointed out, and as a lot of reporting pointed out, the bishop or the diocese stonewalled. They didn't admit anything. They hid documents.
They went into
destroyed
bankruptcy.
Documents.
Yeah, ultimately.
And then, yes, they went into bankruptcy to
avoid going
head
to court,
off that first case.
Right. Well, speaking of the bishop here, it was a bit sobering when you asked him about, geez, can we ever get this problem really behind us? Let's hear what he said on that.
But is it ever possible to entirely eliminate this problem?
No, because it's part of human nature. It exists in every institution in the life of our society. It exists within family life very tragically. Sadly, this is an inclination of the human heart in a number of people.
So, Pete, were you surprised when he said that?
Oh, I was floored. And it really kind of goes back to, I guess, a worldview or a theological view about human nature, what it is that we're all capable of. I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm just saying that it shocked me that he said that, no, we'll never entirely get rid of this.
Well, let's talk about the victims for a moment. 10 years after this settlement here, what's the main sentiment of the folks who went through these horrible experiences? What are they telling you now?
Well, the ones I talked to remain scarred, I think is the best term, and they're also anxious because, this was part of a global scandal. This was happening in dioceses around the world.
Across the country.
The Boston case, which was the subject of the movie Spotlight, may have been the most well-known, but San Diego was a much larger, both in terms of the victims and the settlement that came across. So whenever this comes out in the news, whenever there's a new report of a priest or religious, preying on a young person, it kind of brings it all back. They're just reliving these horrors.
Now, I covered this case for the Union Tribune through the settlement, and for a few years there, as it all came to a head there at the end of that period 10 years ago. And a big portion, aside from the money in the settlement, was getting the information out onto this website. Are the victims satisfied that the church has kind of come clean and put these horrible details out there?
Well, as you mentioned, that was part of the settlement. The settlement was 10 years ago, but it took 3 years. It took another 3 years for the information to be posted online. For a while, it was posted on the Diocese website. It no longer is. You have to go to something called bishopsaccountability.org in order to find it. So they're upset about that, right? They feel that the diocese dragged its feet on posting this, on really coming clean about what was happening.
Mm-hmm. But now, has it been enough out there that folks are generally satisfied?
Well, I don't know if generally satisfied is the right term.
All depends on who you talk to.
Exactly. And the victims and the people who work with them note that, listen, child sexual abuse, because the nature of the crime, usually doesn't come to light until decades later.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. It's a terrific story. If you can, go back to the Sunday Union Tribune and take a look at Pete's work. That does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Lisa Halverstadt of Voice of San Diego, Susan Murphy of KPBS News, J. Harry Jones of the San Diego Union Tribune, and Peter Rowe, also of the Union Tribune. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.